For the first time since moving to Stone Creek Estates, Mike Carter finally felt at peace. No more passive-aggressive notes, no more ridiculous fines, and best of all, no more Karen Whitmore storming up his driveway, barking orders like she ran the world. Ever since she was booted from the HOA, the entire neighborhood felt lighter. People smiled more. Neighbors actually talked to each other instead of peeking through their blinds in fear of an HOA citation. Mike leaned back in his chair, stretching out on his front porch. The evening air was crisp, the smell of barbecue drifting from a few houses down. His buddy Tom, the old-timer who had lived here for years, strolled up the driveway with a knowing smirk. "Man, it's almost too peaceful," Tom said, cracking open a cold beer. "It's like the storm finally passed." Mike chuckled. "Yeah, kinda weird, isn't it? Feels like we actually live in a normal neighborhood now." Tom took a slow sip, then shot him a look. "Maybe a little too normal." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Oh, come on. Karen's gone. The HOA is under new leadership, and I haven't had a single fine in weeks. What could possibly go wrong?" Tom sighed, shaking his head. "That's what they always say in the movies, right before things go to hell." Mike laughed it off, but a tiny voice in the back of his mind nagged at him. Tom wasn't wrong. Karen had been the kind of person who thrived on control. Watching her empire crumble in front of her must have driven her crazy. Still, she was done. The HOA was moving on. Mike had nothing to worry about. At least that's what he thought, until he checked his mailbox. Tucked between the usual stack of junk mail and bills was a thick, unmarked envelope. The paper felt expensive, official. His gut twisted as he ripped it open. Inside, printed in bold, unforgiving letters, was a legal notice. His stomach dropped. Karen Whitmore was back. And this time, she wasn't playing games. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. Mike read the letter twice, then a third time. No matter how many times his eyes scanned the page, the words didn't change. Karen Whitmore wasn't just suing the HOA, she was suing him personally. Harassment, defamation, emotional distress, damages. Mike let out a slow, controlled breath, willing himself not to crush the letter in his fist. This had to be a joke, right? A desperate attempt at revenge after she lost everything? But the name at the top of the legal document told him otherwise. The law firm Karen had hired wasn't just some small-town attorney. It was one of the biggest legal firms in the state, the kind that charged more for a single hour of consultation than most people made in a week. Mike's gut twisted. There was no way Karen could afford these guys on her own. Which meant one thing. Someone else was bankrolling this. 15 minutes later, Mike was sitting in his living room, the letter spread out on the coffee table. Tom leaned over, reading it with a deepening frown. "Man, this is bad," Tom muttered. "Like, real bad." "No, kidding," Mike grumbled. "She's not just coming after me. She's coming after the entire HOA." Tom shook his head. "Damn shame. The new board was finally fixing things. Now they're going to be drowning in legal fees." Mike clenched his jaw. That was the real problem. Karen wasn't just out for revenge. She was trying to financially cripple the HOA. And if the board went bankrupt, that meant no funds for community maintenance, no resources to fight back. It meant Karen could come slithering back in, pretending to be the only one who could save the neighborhood. "This isn't just a lawsuit," Mike said. "It's a power move." Tom sat back, rubbing his chin. "Yeah, but the real question is, who's bankrolling her?" Mike exhaled sharply. "That's what I need to find out." The next morning, Mike met with the new HOA president, Linda, at the community center. She was already pale before he even sat down. "You got one too, huh?" Mike said, nodding at the identical legal letter sitting on the table. Linda groaned, rubbing her temples. "This is a nightmare. Do you have any idea how much it'll cost just to get a lawyer to fight this?" Mike did. "And it wasn't cheap. If we don't defend ourselves, we lose by default," Linda continued. "But if we do fight, we might not have enough in the HOA budget to keep up with the legal fees." "That's the whole point," Mike said grimly. "Karen doesn't care if she wins. She just wants to drain us dry." Linda sighed, shaking her head. The HOA's finances aren't exactly great right now, and with Karen's connections, she could drag this case out for months, maybe even years. Mike frowned. Connections? Linda hesitated, then reached into her folder, pulling out a second document. This isn't just about Karen, she said. Look at who's listed as her co-plaintiff. Mike's eyes scanned the page, and then they stopped cold. Richard Sterling. His blood boiled. Richard, the same smug HOA vice president who had helped Karen run the neighborhood like a dictatorship. The same guy who had turned on her when things went south. Mike had thought he was done with all this. But apparently, Richard had been playing the long game. That son of a... Mike muttered. Linda nodded grimly. Looks like Karen wasn't acting alone after all. Mike sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel as he processed everything. Karen and Richard. Teaming up. It made sense now. Richard had always been the power-hungry type, but when Karen got removed, he had to lay low. Now, with the HOA in weakened financial shape, he saw the perfect opportunity to strike. And Karen? She wasn't the type to go down without a fight. This wasn't just about money. This was about taking back control. Mike exhaled slowly, his mind racing through his options. There was no way in hell he was letting these two snakes win. Not again. If Karen wanted a fight, she was going to get one, and this time, Mike was ready for war. Mike had never been the kind of guy to back down from a fight, but this lawsuit? It wasn't just a fight, it was war. Karen and Richard weren't just trying to win in court. They wanted to crush him, to drain the HOA of every last cent until they could slither back into power. And if that happened, the entire neighborhood would be under their iron grip again. Mike wasn't about to let that happen, so, after the shock wore off, he got to work. For the next few days, he dug through every email, text, and HOA notice he had saved from Karen's reign. He called neighbors, asking if they had any documents or fines from her rule that might show a pattern of abuse. Slowly, he started piecing together a timeline of Karen's power-hungry antics. But it wasn't enough. If he was going to fight this lawsuit, he needed something bigger, something that could turn the tables completely. Then, one night, he got it. It was nearly midnight when the knocking started. Not a casual knock, not the light tap of a neighbor stopping by. No, this was urgent. Mike frowned as he walked to the door. He hadn't been expecting anyone. He opened it cautiously, his grip tightening on the handle. A tall, weathered man stood on his porch, dressed in dark jeans and a jacket that had seen better days. His face was lined with age, his graying beard neatly trimmed, but it was his eyes that caught Mike's attention. Sharp, calculating, like he had seen things. "Mike Carter?" the man asked. His voice was rough, like he'd spent years smoking or shouting over machinery. Mike hesitated. "Who's asking?" The man glanced over his shoulder, as if making sure they weren't being watched. "My name's Greg Dawson," he said, lowering his voice. "I used to be on the HOA board, before Karen got rid of me." Mike's eyes narrowed. "You're saying she kicked you out?" Greg let out a dry chuckle. "Oh, she didn't just kick me out. She set me up. Falsified reports. Made it look like I was mismanaging funds so she could have me removed." Mike felt a flicker of recognition. Now that he thought about it, he remembered hearing rumors about an HOA treasurer being forced out a few years back. But at the time, everyone had just believed Karen's version of the story. Mike folded his arms. "And why are you here now?" Greg reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder. "Because I've been waiting for the right time to take her down," he said. "And from what I hear, you're the guy to do it." Mike sat at his kitchen table, flipping through the documents Greg had handed him, and the deeper he read, the angrier he got. The folder was a goldmine. Emails, financial reports, even internal HOA memos, and they all pointed to one thing. Karen had been embezzling HOA funds for years. Not only that, but she had used those funds to hire private investigators, run smear campaigns, and pay off certain board members to keep them quiet. "This is insane," Mike muttered, shaking his head. Greg took a sip of coffee, watching him carefully. "Told you. Karen was playing chess while the rest of us were playing checkers." Mike set the papers down and exhaled sharply. "This is enough to bury her," Greg nodded. "Maybe, but be careful." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Greg leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Because Karen isn't stupid, he said. She always has a backup plan. Mike's jaw tightened. What do you mean? Greg hesitated, then pulled out one last piece of paper. Mike unfolded it and felt a cold chill crawl down his spine. At the top, stamped in bold letters, was an official document. It was a proposal. And the name at the bottom? Richard Sterling. Mike's blood ran cold. She's not just trying to win this lawsuit, Greg said. She's planning to dissolve the HOA completely. For the past few days, Mike had been one step ahead of Karen, but he should have known better. Karen never played fair. And now, she wasn't just suing him. She was trying to take back the HOA. It started with whispers. A few neighbors mentioned seeing strange meetings happening late at night, small gatherings at Richard Sterling's house. People who had once pretended to hate Karen were suddenly chatting with her on their porches. Then came the anonymous letters. Linda, the new HOA president, burst into Mike's driveway one morning, waving a handful of them. 27, she said breathlessly. Mike blinked. What? 27 anonymous votes calling for an emergency recall election. She spat, shoving the papers into his hands. Someone is trying to kick us off the board. Mike scanned the letters. Each one demanded a leadership change. No names, no signatures, just printed text as if someone had gone door to door, convincing people to send in a vote without revealing themselves. Mike's jaw tightened. This is Karen. Linda nodded. She's rallying her old supporters. Mike exhaled sharply. So, what's the plan? Linda squared her shoulders. We call a vote, and we fight back. The emergency HOA meeting was held 2 days later at the community center. Word had spread like wildfire. Neighbors filled every chair, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Mike leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, scanning the crowd. Too many familiar faces. Too many people who had once stood against Karen now whispering among themselves. Then, at exactly 7:00 p.m., the doors swung open. And there she was, Karen Whitmore. She strutted into the room, dressed like she was, still in charge, her clipboard clutched like a weapon. Richard Sterling followed behind her, smirking like a man who knew he was about to win. Linda's face hardened. Karen, she said coolly, you're not on the board anymore. You don't have the right to be here. Karen smiled. That fake, polished, Karen's smile that had fooled so many people for so long. Oh, Linda, she said sweetly. I think you'll find that I do. Then she turned to the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced, I come before you today not as a former HOA president, but as a concerned neighbor. Our community is falling apart under this so-called new leadership. Murmurs rippled through the room. Some nodded. Others exchanged glances. Karen pressed on. Late fees are being waived. Trash violations are being ignored. Property values are at risk, she declared. I've spent years protecting this neighborhood, and I refuse to sit by and watch it be destroyed by people who don't care about it the way I do. A few people clapped. Mike clenched his jaw. Karen was good. Too good. She knew how to spin her downfall into some grand sacrifice. And worst of all, some people were buying it. Richard stepped forward. That's why tonight we are demanding an immediate vote on the future of this HOA board. Linda's fists clenched. You can't. Oh, but we can. Karen cut in smoothly. We have the votes. She turned to the audience, smiling like a queen about to reclaim her throne. This is our neighborhood, and it's time to take it back. For a moment, Mike actually thought she might win. But then, he pulled out his own folder. I'm sorry, Mike said, stepping forward. Did you say you've spent years protecting this neighborhood? Karen narrowed her eyes. That's right, Mike smirked. Interesting, because this says otherwise. He dropped a thick stack of documents onto the table in front of the board. The room fell silent. What is that? Karen demanded. Mike looked her dead in the eye. Proof. Then he turned to the audience. This is a record of every shady financial move Karen made while she was president. Linda picked up a paper and read aloud. HOA funds used for private contractors. Personal expenses disguised as community improvements. Fines issued without board approval. Mike folded his arms. Karen didn't protect this neighborhood. She robbed it. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. The people who had clapped for Karen moments ago were suddenly silent. Karen's face twitched. This is ridiculous, she stammered. These are lies. Mike pulled out one final paper and held it up. Oh yeah? Then why is your signature on every one of them? Karen's mouth snapped shut. For the first time in years, Karen Whitmore was losing control of the room. People were whispering, shifting uncomfortably. Even Richard took a step back. Then Linda stood up. She looked Karen dead in the eye. The only thing getting voted on tonight, she said coldly, is whether we file a lawsuit against you for fraud. The crowd erupted. Some people cheered, others gasped. Karen. Karen turned pale. She spun toward Richard. Say something, she hissed. But Richard, he just shook his head. He wasn't going down with her. For the first time in HOA history, Karen Whitmore had lost. But as she stormed out of the meeting, one thing was clear. She wasn't done yet. Mike had thought the war was almost over. Karen was exposed. Her schemes were laid bare, and the neighborhood had finally turned against her. But he should have known. Snakes don't slither alone, and just when he thought he had won, a familiar voice shattered his confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Sterling said, stepping forward with a smug grin, I believe we have a problem. The HOA meeting, which had just been on the verge of celebrating Karen's downfall, fell silent. Richard strode to the front of the room, adjusting his suit jacket like he owned the place. First off, he said smoothly, let me just say I have always been a firm believer in democracy. And tonight's events? He gestured toward Karen, who still looked stunned. They've been enlightening. Mike narrowed his eyes. What was he playing at? Richard turned to the crowd, his expression shifting into one of mock concern. But I think there's been a misunderstanding, he continued. Because while Karen may have overstepped in the past, we must ask ourselves, does that really mean we should dismantle everything she worked for? Linda scoffed. Oh, give me a break. You were the first to throw her under the bus when things got bad. Richard gave a polished chuckle. Yes, well, self-preservation is important. He clasped his hands together. But let's not dwell on the past. Then, he pulled a thick stack of papers from his briefcase. Mike's stomach sank. Here it comes. I took the liberty of reviewing the HOA's bylaws, Richard said, flipping through the documents. And as it turns out, there's a small legal issue with the way this new board was formed. Linda's expression hardened. What are you talking about? Richard smirked. According to our own HOA regulations, any vote to remove a sitting president must be conducted with a supermajority. The vote that removed Karen? He let out a theatrical sigh. It was one vote short. The room erupted. Neighbors murmured in confusion, some outraged, some uncertain. Mike's blood boiled. He could see it now. Richard had played both sides from the very beginning. He had only turned on Karen when it was convenient. And now that? She was weak. He was swooping in, using her as a pawn to regain power. Karen, who had been silent, suddenly perked up. You mean, she said slowly, my removal was invalid? Richard flashed her a knowing smile. That's exactly what I mean. Linda slammed a fist on the table. That's ridiculous. We held a legal vote. Richard raised a hand. But legality is tricky, isn't it? He tapped the papers. The HOA board may have acted in good faith, but technicalities matter. And if this goes to court, he spread his hands, it'll be ruled null and void. Mike clenched his jaw. So what's your angle, Richard? You want Karen reinstated? Richard let out a mock laugh. Oh, heavens no! Karen's reputation is, well, let's be honest, a little tarnished at the moment. Karen shot him a glare, but he ignored her. No, what I'm proposing, Richard continued, is that we form a new board, one that truly represents this community. Linda folded her arms. Let me guess, you'd be in charge. Richard grinned. Now, let's not make this personal. Mike stepped forward. Cut the crap, Richard. This isn't about fairness. This is about power. Richard's smile never wavered. Mike, my friend, power is simply the ability to read the rules better than everyone else. Mike's hands curled into fists. Karen may have been ruthless, but Richard was calculated. This wasn't just about the HOA anymore. This fight was far from over. Mike had dealt with bullies before. Karen. She was loud and relentless, but she was easy to expose. She let her ego run the show, and that made her predictable. Richard? He was worse. He was calculated, patient, the kind of guy who would smile while he stabbed you in the back. And now, with Karen under his control, he was making his move, and if they didn't stop him now, he wouldn't just take over the HOA, he'd own it. Mike and Linda sat in her living room, stacks of papers spread across the coffee table. "We're running out of time," Linda muttered, rubbing her temples. "The vote is in 3 days. If Richard wins, he'll rewrite the bylaws to make himself untouchable." Mike exhaled sharply. "Then we need something big, something that will end this once and for all." Tom, who had been listening from the kitchen, leaned against the doorway. "What about those old HOA financial records? There's got to be something shady in there." Linda shook her head. "We checked. Everything's been cleaned up." Mike frowned. That didn't feel right. Karen had been running the HOA like her personal kingdom for years. There had to be a paper trail. And then it hit him. "What if she didn't clean it up?" Mike said slowly. Linda blinked. "What do you mean?" Mike grabbed his phone and pulled up the HOA's archived financial statements, the public ones, the ones that looked too perfect. "What if she didn't erase the evidence?" Mike continued. "What if she just hid it somewhere else?" Tom's eyes widened. "Like an off-the-books account?" Linda leaned forward. "If we can find that, we can prove Karen and Richard were funneling HOA money for their own benefit." Mike nodded. "And that would be enough to get the entire lawsuit thrown out. The only problem? They had no idea where to look. For the next few hours, they dug through every financial document they could find. Bank statements, vendor payments, fines issued under Karen's rule, anything that seemed off. And then they found it. Buried in old payment records, Linda noticed something weird. "A landscaping company?" she muttered, squinting at the name. "Since when did we pay a landscaping company $15,000 for grass treatment?" Mike frowned. "We don't even have a community garden." Tom chuckled. "That's because it's fake." They stared at him. He pointed at the bank account. Number listed next to the payment. "See this? That's not a business account. That's a personal account." Linda's jaw dropped. "You're telling me Karen funneled HOA money into a fake business so she could pay herself?" Tom smirked. "Oh yeah, classic fraud move." Mike grinned. "Then I guess it's time to let the neighborhood know what their future HOA leaders have been up to." The next morning, Mike started knocking on doors. Most of the neighbors were tired of HOA drama, but when he showed them the financial records, their frustration turned into outrage. "Wait, so all those fines we paid?" one man muttered. "They just kept the money?" "Oh, Karen is going down for this," Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman across the street, said firmly. Word spread fast. By noon, half the neighborhood knew the truth. Which meant Karen and Richard knew, too. That night, the intimidation started. Linda found a fake violation notice on her doorstep claiming her house was out of compliance. Tom got a legal threat in the mail, warning him not to spread false information. And Mike? Mike woke up to find his tires slashed. He stood in his driveway, staring at the damage, his fists clenching. Karen and Richard were getting desperate. Good. That meant they were scared. The night before the vote, Mike met with the HOA board one last time. "We have everything," Linda said, gesturing to the thick folder of documents. "Fraud, embezzlement, intimidation. If we present this at the meeting, they're done." Mike nodded, but something felt off. Richard was too smart to let this happen. "Double-check everything," Mike said. "If they're planning something, we need to be ready." Linda nodded. "Tomorrow, we end this." Mike hoped she was right, because if they lost this vote, the neighborhood was theirs, and this time, no one would be able to stop them. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors filled the benches, whispering among themselves. Some were here for justice, others just for the drama. At the defense table, Mike sat beside Linda and their lawyer, flipping through a thick folder of evidence. Across from them, Karen and Richard sat smugly, their own lawyer straightening his tie like he already knew he was about to win. Karen's confidence was nauseating. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "Let's get to it," she said. The battle for the neighborhood had officially begun. Karen's lawyer went on the attack immediately. "Your Honor," he said, pacing the floor, "this case is not about fraud or misconduct. This is about a group of disgruntled homeowners trying to ruin my clients' reputations." Mike clenched his jaw. Karen Whitmore dedicated years to this community. The lawyer continued, "And yet, the moment she enforces the rules, she's met with resistance. This lawsuit? It's nothing more than a petty vendetta." Mike exchanged a glance with Linda. They had expected this. Karen was playing the victim, like always. Then the lawyer turned toward the judge with a smug smile. "In fact," he added, "I'd like to call my first witness, Karen Whitmore." Karen sauntered to the stand, her expression a perfect mix of self-righteousness and fake concern. The lawyer folded his hands. "Mrs. Whitmore, in your years as HOA president, did you ever act with anything other than the best interest of the community in mind?" "Never," Karen said smoothly. "Everything I did was for the good of the neighborhood." Mike almost laughed out loud. For the next 20 minutes, Karen spun a web of lies. She painted herself as a dedicated leader, someone who only wanted to maintain order. She even fake cried at one point. Mike wasn't buying it. And neither was the judge. When Karen's lawyer finally sat down, Mike's attorney stood up. "I'd like to call Tom Jacobs to the stand." Mike turned, watching as Tom, his old-school, no-nonsense neighbor, stood and made his way forward. Karen's smirk faltered. Tom adjusted his bolo tie before settling into the witness seat. The man looked like he had zero patience for nonsense. Mike grinned. This was about to get interesting. "Mr. Jacobs," the attorney began, "how long have you lived in Stone Creek Estates?" 15 years, Tom said, his voice firm. "And in that time, did you ever have any issues with the HOA?" Tom chuckled. "Did I? The HOA under Karen was a nightmare." Karen stiffened. Tom leaned forward. "She fined people for Christmas decorations, harassed an elderly couple until they moved. She even tried to tow a cop's truck off his own property." The judge raised an eyebrow. "A police vehicle?" Mike smirked. Karen's lawyer stood. "Objection! Irrelevant!" Mike's lawyer shook his head. "I assure you, Your Honor, this is very relevant." The judge nodded. "I'd like to hear more." Tom grinned. For the next 10 minutes, he destroyed Karen's credibility. He listed violation after violation, proving a clear pattern of harassment and abuse. Karen squirmed in her seat, but just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse for her, she played her final card. She stood suddenly, her lawyer barely able to stop her. "Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking with fake outrage, "this entire case is built on a lie. The HOA was illegally influenced by law enforcement." Mike froze. "Oh, she was really doing this?" Karen turned toward the judge dramatically. "When my truck towing incident happened, the sheriff got personally involved. He used his authority to intimidate us." She shot a glare at Mike. "And now, we're supposed to believe this trial is fair?" The courtroom fell silent. For the first time, Mike felt a sliver of doubt. Karen was twisting the truth, and the judge was listening carefully. Then Mike's lawyer stood up, and he was smiling. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, reaching into the folder, "since we're talking about intimidation, I'd like to present Exhibit B." He handed a document to the judge. Karen frowned. The judge scanned the page, and her eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said slowly, "can you explain why HOA funds were being funneled into a private bank account?" Karen blanched. Mike felt his pulse steady. This was it. His lawyer placed more documents on the table. Records show that thousands of dollars were transferred to an account under Karen's control. That money was meant for HOA maintenance, but instead, it was used for, he checked the files, private security services? A new pool heater? The judge wasn't amused. Karen's lawyer was sweating. And Karen? Karen looked like she might faint. 10 minutes later, the judge made her ruling. This court finds that Mrs. Whitmore and Mr. Sterling engaged in fraud, harassment, and misuse of HOA funds. Richard's head snapped toward Karen. "You told me everything was covered," he hissed. Karen didn't respond. She was too busy staring at the table, defeated. The judge continued. "All charges against the current HOA board are dismissed. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to law enforcement for a formal investigation into financial misconduct. Mike felt relief crash over him. It was over. Karen and Richard had lost. But just as the courtroom erupted in murmurs, Mike saw something. Karen wasn't looking at the judge anymore. She was looking at him, and in her eyes, pure hatred. Mike knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The courtroom was dead silent. Karen sat frozen in her seat, eyes darting between the judge and the evidence spread before her. Next to her, Richard had gone pale, his usual smug expression completely wiped away. Mike had been waiting for this moment. The judge adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. This court finds that Mrs. Whitmore and Mr. Sterling engaged in fraud, harassment, and gross misuse of HOA funds. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Karen's fingers tightened on the table. Richard slowly leaned back, breathing heavily. The judge continued. As a result, both defendants are permanently banned from holding any position within the HOA. Furthermore, they will be required to pay $250,000 in restitution to the community for their financial misconduct. The courtroom erupted. Some neighbors cheered, others murmured in disbelief. But Karen? Karen snapped. 1 second, she was sitting still. The next, she lunged at Mike. "You ruined everything!" she shrieked, her face twisted in pure hatred. Mike barely had time to react before she lunged across the table, hands clawing toward him. A deputy grabbed her midair, yanking her back before she could get close. "Let go of me!" she screamed, thrashing in his grip. "This isn't over! Ma'am," the deputy interrupted coldly. "You just assaulted someone in a courtroom." Karen froze. Realization dawned on her face. And then? The deputy pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "You're under arrest." The judge sighed. "Take her away." Karen let out a strangled noise as she was dragged toward the exit, her screaming voice fading into the hallway. Mike just watched. It was over. Finally. Or at least that's what he thought, until he looked at Richard and realized Richard was gone. The panic started immediately. "Where the hell is Richard?" Linda hissed, scanning the room. Mike's head whipped around. Richard had been right there. But now? His seat was empty. The back doors of the courtroom swung gently. Mike's stomach sank. He slipped out. Tom muttered. "That sneaky bastard ran." "Doesn't matter," Linda said. "The ruling still stands. He'll be arrested soon enough." Mike wasn't so sure. Because Richard wasn't like Karen. Karen was loud, reckless. She made mistakes. But Richard was smart, and that made him dangerous. 3 days later, the neighborhood was in full celebration mode. With Karen and Richard officially out, the new HOA board wasted no time undoing their mess. Unfair rules, gone. Fake fines, refunded. And the best part? The entire community came together. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid to decorate their homes, park their cars, or simply enjoy their own property. Mike was grilling on his porch when Tom walked up, cracking open a beer. "Well," Tom said, raising his drink, "we actually did it." Mike smirked. "Told you. Karen was never gonna win." Tom nodded. "Yeah? But what about Richard?" Mike exhaled. "Cops are looking for him. But something tells me he planned for this." Tom frowned. "What makes you say that?" Mike didn't answer, because at that moment he noticed something in his mailbox. A single white envelope, unmarked. Mike's pulse picked up. Slowly he pulled it out, flipping it over. No name, no return address, just a single handwritten note inside. Mike unfolded the paper. And the second he read it, his stomach dropped. "You won this battle, but I'm still watching." Mike's grip tightened. Tom glanced over. "What is it?" Mike crumpled the note. "Nothing," he muttered, but deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't over, not even close. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe too. Stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.